The mud of the pen had its own kind of memory. It clung to Clara Prescott's skin, a cold, greedy paste that remembered every rainstorm, every spill of slop, every moment of her degradation. The year was 1878, and for Clara, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of this enclosure, its split-rail fence a stark boundary between her life and the one she once knew. The sour stench of the pigs, her only companions, was the air she breathed, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. She had not fallen, she had been pushed. After their father's death, her brothers, Amos and Walter, had inherited the farm, and with it, dominion over her. They were men carved from the hard, unforgiving earth they worked, their minds as fallow as the rock-strewn fields. They resented her books, the way she spoke in complete sentences, the quiet pride she took in the education their father had insisted upon. They called it arrogance. To them, an educated woman was like a gilded plough-wooseless for the real work and a mockery of their own plainness. Too proud, Amos had spat, his voice thick with the cheap whiskey he favored. "Thinks she's a queen." Walter, ever his brother's echo, had nodded. "Pride needs breaking. Father spoiled her. We'll fix his mistake." Their solution was the pig pen. It was a punishment of exquisite cruelty, designed not just to confine her body, but to annihilate her spirit. They wanted to strip away the person she was, layer by layer, until all that remained was the same mud-caked desperation as the beasts she lived among. Each morning, Walter would dump a bucket of scraps over the fence: potato peels, moldy bread, whatever was destined for the hogs. That was her portion, to be fought for or ignored. At first, she had refused, her stomach clenching with a defiant hunger. But survival was a primal thing, a current that ran deeper than pride. She learned to eat when the hulking animals were at the other end of the pen, her movements swift and furtive. She held on to herself in fragments. She recited poetry in her head, the verses of Keats and Longfellow, a secret garden in the desolate landscape of her mind. She traced geometric shapes in the dirt with a stick, remembering her lessons in mathematics, imposing order on the chaos. She watched the sun rise and set, marking the passage of days not with hope, but with a grim, methodical endurance. Her fine dresses were long gone, replaced by a single tattered shift that was now the color of the earth. Her hair, once her vanity, was a matted tangle. But in the privacy of her own skull, she was still Clara Prescott. They could cage her body, but they had not yet captured her mind. Loneliness was a physical weight. It pressed on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The pigs, with their simple, brutish existence, offered no comfort. They were merely witnesses, their vacant eyes reflecting her own squalor. Sometimes, she would press her face against the rough wood of the fence, gazing at the small, dilapidated farmhouse where her brothers lived. She could hear their rough laughter, smell the scent of roasting meat, and the alienation was a blade twisting in her gut. She was an outcast in her own home, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. This was her stasis, a monotonous cycle of filth, hunger, and a desperate, silent battle to remember who she was. One afternoon, when the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, baking the mud into a cracked mosaic, she saw them. They appeared on the horizon as dark, fluid shapes, resolving slowly into a small party of riders. They were not settlers. Their posture, the way they moved as one with their horses, spoke of a different world. As they drew closer, she recognized them as Lakota. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, coiled in her stomach. Her brother's hatred for the native people was a virulent thing, second only to their contempt for her. The lead rider was a man of imposing stillness. He sat atop a magnificent black horse, a creature of muscle and fire that seemed to dwarf the other mounts. Even from a distance, Clara could feel the authority that radiated from him, as tangible as the heat shimmering off the plains. His face was a mask of stoic lines, his long, dark hair bound with leather. He and his half-dozen men reined in their horses a respectful distance from the farmhouse, their presence a silent question in the vast, empty landscape. Amos and Walter emerged from the house, rifles held loosely but ready. Clara shrank back, trying to make herself small, to blend in with the shadows and the filth. To be seen like this by anyone was a profound shame, but to be seen by a stranger, a man who represented the wild freedom of the plains she could only dream of, was a unique and searing torture. The Lakota chief dismounted, his movements economical and precise. He approached the porch, his men remaining mounted behind him. Clara could not hear the words, only the low, guttural murmur of the chief's voice and the loud, aggressive tones of her brothers. They were negotiating, trading. This was a common, if tense, occurrence on the frontier. Supplies for pelts, perhaps. She watched, her heart a leaden drum against her ribs. Then the chief's head turned. His gaze swept across the yard, past the rusting farm equipment, past the scraggly chickens pecking in the dust, and settled on the pig pen. It settled on her. For a long moment, his eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers. Clara felt a hot flush of humiliation crawl up her neck. She wanted to dissolve, to sink into the mud and disappear. She expected to see disgust in his face, or perhaps cruel amusement. She saw neither. Instead, she saw a flicker of something she could not name: stillness, a profound and absolute attention that seemed to pierce through the grime and see the raw, living core of her. His focus broke the flow of the negotiation. Amos, noticing the direction of the man's stare, let out a harsh bark of laughter. "What? You looking at that?" He jeered, gesturing with his thumb toward the pen. "That's our sister, Clara." Walter chimed in, his voice slick with malice. "Got a little too proud for her own good. Thought her learning made her better than us. We're teaching her some humility. A woman's place ain't with her nose in a book." The chief, Chayton, did not respond to their taunts. His gaze remained on Clara, and in that moment she felt a shift in the world. He was not looking at a broken thing in a pig pen. He was looking at a person. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension. His silence was a judgment far more potent than any outcry. The casual cruelty of her brothers was laid bare under his quiet scrutiny, and for the first time Clara saw them through a stranger's eyes, not as her kin, but as vulgar, brutish men. The shame she felt was suddenly not just for herself, but for them, for the ugliness they had cultivated in this isolated patch of dirt. The transaction for grain and smoked meat had been interrupted by an unexpected commodity, the spectacle of her suffering, and the buyer, it seemed, was appraising more than just the goods on offer. Chayton's attention remained fixed on the pen, a silent indictment that unnerved Amos and Walter far more than any argument would have. He had come for provisions, a simple transaction of necessity, but the sight of the woman in the enclosure had fundamentally altered the nature of his visit. He saw the defiant tilt of her chin, the intelligence that burned in her eyes, despite the degradation surrounding her. He had seen spirit animals trapped and fighting, and he recognized the same fierce, captured energy in her. He turned his focus back to the brothers, his expression unreadable. "You ask a high price for old grain?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "The meat is poorly salted." His assessment was flat, a simple statement of fact that carried no insult, yet stripped away their blustering pride. Amos bristled. "It's good enough for you. Take it or leave it. We ain't running a charity." Chayton's gaze drifted back to Clara, then returned to Amos. A long, weighted silence stretched between them. The prairie wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound besides the grunting of the pigs. Then Chayton spoke, his words dropping like stones into a still pond. "What for the woman?" The question hung in the air, so outrageous that for a moment neither brother understood. Then Walter let out a choked snort, which turned into a full-blown, wheezing laugh. Amos joined him, slapping his thigh, the tension of the encounter breaking into derisive humor. "The woman?" Amos roared, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You want to trade for her? She's worthless. Good for nothing but slop in the hogs. Can't cook, can't clean, just sits and thinks her high and mighty thoughts. Chaitan waited for their laughter to subside, his patience as vast and unyielding as the sky above. "I will trade for her," he repeated, his tone unchanged. The brothers exchanged a look, their amusement curdling into cunning. They saw an opportunity. This strange, stoic chief was either a fool or insane, but it made no difference to them. They could rid themselves of their troublesome sister and profit from it. "All right, chief," Amos said, a greedy glint in his eye. "You want her, you can have her, but she'll cost you." He looked Chaitan up and down, his gaze settling on the magnificent black horse. It was an animal of obvious value, a war horse of a quality rarely seen. The request was designed to be an insult, an impossible price meant to end the absurd negotiation. "She'll cost you that horse." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She watched from the pen, a spectator at her own auction. The black horse was clearly the chief's most prized possession. It was a part of him, a symbol of his status, his power, his very identity as a warrior and leader. He would refuse. Of course, he would refuse. This was just another layer to her humiliation, another joke at her expense. But Chaitan did not refuse. He did not even hesitate. He simply turned, walked to the black horse, and ran a hand down its powerful neck in a gesture of quiet farewell. Then, without a backward glance, he took the leather reins and held them out to Amos. The silence that followed was absolute. The brothers stared, their mouths agape, at the reins being offered to them. They had not expected this. The value of the horse was immense, far exceeding that of any supplies on their farm. To trade such an animal for a woman they deemed worthless was an act that defied all logic they understood. Amos slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took the reins, his eyes wide with disbelief. The transaction was done. Chaitan walked over to the pig pen. Walter, still stunned, fumbled with the latch on the gate and swung it open. The stench rolled out, thicker in the open air. Clara stood frozen, mud clinging to her legs, the tattered shift hanging from her bony frame. She was being traded from one form of captivity to another, from the familiar cruelty of her brothers to the terrifying unknown of life among the Lakota. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a tiny, bewildered flicker of something else ignited. This man had looked at her, at the lowest point of her existence, and seen a value equal to his most prized possession. He had not haggled, he had not bartered, he had simply paid the price. One of his men dismounted and approached with a length of rope. He looped it gently, almost impersonally, around her wrists. The touch was not violent, but it was possessive. She was property that had been bought and paid for. Chaitan gestured for her to walk, and on numb, unsteady legs, Clara stepped out of the pig pen and left the only home she had ever known behind. She did not look back at her brothers, who were busy admiring their new horse, their faces alight with greedy triumph. She kept her eyes on the dusty ground in front of her, her world once again narrowed, but this time it was a path leading away, into a future she could not begin to imagine. The journey was a blur of dust and sky. Clara walked, her bare feet cracked and bleeding on the rough prairie ground. Chaitan rode his new mount, a sturdy but unremarkable bay that had belonged to one of his men. He kept a steady pace, never pushing her beyond the limits of her endurance, but never slowing for her, either. She was a piece of baggage he was transporting, an acquisition to be brought back to his camp. The sun was relentless, and the vast, open space that had once represented freedom to her now felt like an enormous, empty prison. She remained wrapped in a cocoon of fear and mistrust. What did this man want from her? Was she to be a slave, a drudge for his entire band, a wife? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She was filthy, starved, and traumatized. She had nothing to offer, nothing to give. Her mind, her only refuge, raced with horrifying possibilities. She braced herself for the inevitable cruelty, for the moment his detached civility would drop away to reveal the savage her brothers had always described. But the cruelty never came. On the first evening, they made camp near a small cottonwood-lined creek. Chaitan gestured for her to sit, then handed her a piece of dried bison meat and a water skin. She took them with trembling hands, her eyes downcast, expecting a trick or a demand. There was none. He and his men ate their own rations in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the small fire and the soft murmur of the wind. He noticed the deep, festering cut on her hand, a wound from a sharp rock in the pen that she had ignored for days. After he finished his meal, he went to the creek bed, returning with a handful of broad leaves. He crushed them between two stones, creating a green, fragrant poultice. He approached her, and she flinched, pulling her hand back instinctively. "It will poison your blood," he said, his first direct words to her since leaving the farm. His voice was low and even. He did not command her, he stated a fact. Hesitantly, she extended her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound with water from the skin and applied the herbal paste. He wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth torn from one of his own bags. The gesture was so devoid of malice, so practical and impersonal, that it disarmed her. It was an act of maintenance, like tending to a horse's lame foot. Yet, it was the first act of care she had received in months. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She wiped it away, angry at her own weakness. That night, as she lay shivering on the hard ground, wrapped in a thin blanket one of the men had tossed her way, a storm rolled in. The sky, which had been a placid canvas of stars, turned a violent, bruised purple. Lightning spiderwebbed across the horizon, followed by a low growl of thunder that vibrated through the earth. The wind rose to a howl, whipping sand and leaves into the air. Chaitan and his men moved with practiced efficiency, securing the horses and their packs. Chaitan pointed to a shallow overhang in a rock formation a short distance from their camp. "Shelter," he commanded. Clara scrambled towards it, the first drops of rain, fat and cold, striking her skin. The space was cramped, barely large enough for them all to huddle together out of the driving rain. She found a spot in the back, pressing herself against the cold stone, trying to be invisible. But in the confined space, proximity was unavoidable. She was shoulder to shoulder with one of the warriors, the heat from his body a strange and unnerving intrusion. Chaitan sat near the opening, a stoic silhouette against the flashing, storm-racked sky. The storm raged for hours. It was a terrifying display of nature's power, yet inside their small refuge, a strange sense of calm prevailed. The Lakota men were unperturbed. They spoke softly among themselves, their language a rhythmic counterpoint to the fury outside. No one paid her any mind. She was simply there, another body seeking shelter from the tempest. In this forced intimacy, her fear began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She was no longer just a white woman, an object of trade. She was a fellow creature weathering a storm. Chaitan, who could have asserted his power over her in any number of ways, had done nothing. He had fed her, tended her wound, and provided her shelter, all with the same detached gravity. He had treated her not as property to be used, but as a responsibility he had taken on. The wall of her mistrust did not crumble, but a single tiny crack appeared in its formidable facade. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if he had traded his horse not to own her, but to free her. The thought was so radical, so contrary to everything she believed about her own worthlessness, that she immediately dismissed it. But it lingered, a stubborn seed planted in the barren soil of her despair. After several days of travel, they crested a rise, and Clara saw the camp below. It was a sprawling collection of teepees nestled in a river valley, smoke curling lazily into the vast blue sky. The sight of it, a community teeming with life, sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. Here, she would not be an abstract curiosity. She would be a physical presence, an alien entity in their world. As they rode into the camp, a silence fell. Faces turned to watch them, dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Children stopped their games to stare. Women paused their work, their expressions guarded. She was an outsider, a Wasichu, a member of the race that was relentlessly pushing them from their ancestral lands, killing the bison and breaking sacred treaties. Her presence was a violation, an intrusion of a hostile world into their sanctuary. Chaitan dismounted and spoke to an elder who came to meet him. Their conversation was quiet and serious. All the while, Clara felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. She stood by the horse, her hands still loosely bound, her head held high out of sheer, desperate instinct. She would not show them the terror that was clawing at her insides. A warrior, his face set in hard, angry lines, strode forward. He pointed a finger at Clara, his voice sharp and accusatory as he spoke to Chaitan in their native tongue. Clara could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear in his tone and his aggressive posture. He was furious. Clara identified him as Kangay. His eyes burned with a righteous fire. "You bring this here," he demanded, his voice ringing through the silent camp. "You traded your finest horse, the pride of your herd, for a white woman. Have you lost your senses, Chaitan? She is a bad omen. She will bring soldiers and trouble down on us. They will say we stole her." Another elder spoke, his voice calmer but filled with concern. "Kangi speaks with a hard tongue, but his heart is not wrong. This is a dangerous path, Chaitan. We have enough enemies without inviting one to sleep in our midst." The camp murmured in agreement. Clara felt a wave of dizziness. She had escaped the pigpen only to be thrown into a den of wolves, her life hanging on the word of a man she barely knew. This was it. This was the moment his intentions would be made clear. He would have to defend his purchase, to explain her purpose. Chaitan stood before his people, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Kangi's fury. He did not look at Clara, he looked at his people, his gaze sweeping over their anxious, questioning faces. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that commanded absolute attention. "I have heard your words," he began. "You see a Wasichu, you see a threat, you see the ghost of the troubles that haunt our people. You are not wrong to be cautious." He paused, letting his words sink in, "But let me tell you what I saw." He described the Prescott farm, the squalor, the casual cruelty of the brothers. He spoke of the pigpen. As he spoke, a hush fell over the crowd. The story was so stark, so brutal, that it transcended the boundaries of race and prejudice. "I did not see a Wasichu woman," Chaitan continued, his voice resonating with a deep, moral authority. "I saw a human being, caged like an animal by her own bloodkin. I saw a spirit they tried to crush under their heel, a fire they tried to smother in filth, but they could not. I looked into her eyes and saw that the fire still burned." He turned his head and for the first time looked directly at Clara. His gaze was not one of possession, but of acknowledgement. To leave her in that place would have shamed our own spirits. It would have said that we value a horse more than courage. It would have made us no better than the men who put her there. Her resilience has value, her spirit has value. That is what I traded my horse for. A profound silence followed his speech. He had not defended her as a prize. He had defined her by her inner strength, reframing the transaction not as an acquisition of property, but as an act of recognizing and honoring a fellow spirit. He had held a mirror up to his people and asked them what they truly valued. In that moment, something inside Clara broke free. For months, she had been defined by shame, by what had been done to her. Now this Manthis stranger, this supposed savage, had seen past the mud and the rags and had given her a new definition: resilient, worthy. The word was a balm on a wound she did not even know she had. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of fear or self-pity. They were tears of a great, shuddering release. She took a half-step forward, drawing the attention of the entire camp. Her voice, when she spoke, was a rusty croak from disuse, but it was clear and steady. "My name," she said, looking not at Chaitan but at the faces of the people around her, "is Clara." It was a simple statement, but it was a revolution. It was the first time she had spoken her own name in this new life. It was a reclamation of her identity, an assertion that she was not just the woman, not just a symbol or an object, but a person. She stood a little taller, her ragged shift and bound hands suddenly seeming less important than the unwavering dignity in her gaze. Chaitan's words, followed by her quiet, powerful declaration, shifted the mood of the camp. The open hostility in Kangi's face softened into a grudging respect. The fear in the eyes of the others was replaced by a thoughtful curiosity. The immediate crisis had passed. She was not yet accepted, but she was no longer just an omen. She was Clara. And her journey toward finding a new life, a true home, had just begun. Chaitan's judgment held. Clara was not given to a warrior as a wife, nor was she made a camp drudge. She was granted a peculiar status, one of protected otherness. She was given a small, older tipi at the edge of the camp, a space that was unequivocally her own. It was a profound gift, a recognition of her need for solitude and selfhood. The rope around her wrists was untied, and with that simple act, the last physical symbol of her captivity fell away. Her education in this new world began almost immediately, and it was a humbling experience. An elderly woman named Istas, whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles and whose eyes held a deep, knowing calm, was assigned to be her guide. Istas spoke no English, and Clara knew only a handful of Lakota words. Their communication was a pantomime of gesture, expression, and immense patience. Istas taught her not with lectures, but by doing. She showed Clara how to scrape a hide, the precise angle of the tool, the rhythmic motion that separated flesh from skin. Clara, whose hands were accustomed to the delicate turning of pages, was clumsy and slow. Her palms blistered, her arms ached. She learned how to gather wild turnips and berries, distinguishing the nourishing from the poisonous. She learned to grind corn into meal with a stone, a repetitive, meditative task that quieted the frantic buzzing in her mind. This was a different kind of knowledge than the one she had prized. The poetry of Keats could not teach her how to stitch a moccasin against the coming cold. Her understanding of geometry was useless in learning the intricate patterns of Lakota beadwork. For the first time, she was truly ignorant, a child in a world of profound and practical wisdom. The pride her brothers had sought to beat out of her was now voluntarily surrendered at the altar of necessity. She was not being broken, she was being reshaped, molded by the demands of a life that was honest and real in a way her old one had never been. Slowly, tentatively, she began to heal. The fresh air, the wholesome food, and the physical labor scrubbed the filth from her body and soul. The constant, gnawing fear was replaced by the simple rhythms of daily life. She learned to find joy in small things, the taste of roasted meat after a day of hard work, the shared quiet laughter of the women as they worked together, the breathtaking beauty of a prairie sunset painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. Her relationship with Chaitan remained one of respectful distance. He was the chief, his responsibilities immense as he navigated the treacherous political landscape of a people being squeezed into submission by the United States government. He carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders, a burden that etched deep lines around his eyes. Yet, he would occasionally pass her teepee in the evening and nod, a silent inquiry into her well-being. One evening, she was sitting outside her lodge, practicing the beadwork Istas had been teaching her. Her fingers, once clumsy, were now becoming more adept. Chaitan stopped before her. "The patterns are not easy," he observed, his gaze on her work. "No," she agreed, not looking up. "They have their own language." "Everything does," he said. "You are learning to hear it." She finally lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "You paid a great price for me." The words came out before she could stop them, a question that had been haunting her for months. Why? He considered her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. My horse was strong and swift, he said finally, but its spirit could be broken. I looked at you in that pen, and I saw a spirit that refused to break. Strength of the body is common. Strength of the spirit is rare. It is the only thing of true value. I did not buy you. I bartered for what was already yours. His words settled deep inside her, filling a hollow space she had not known was there. He had not rescued a victim. He had recognized a survivor. He had seen her true worth when she and everyone else had believed it was gone forever. That understanding was the final key, unlocking the last of the grief and shame that had imprisoned her. Months melted into a year. Clara's skin tanned under the sun, and her body grew strong and lean. She learned the language, her tongue slowly mastering the soft consonants and flowing vowels. She was no longer Clara Prescott, the disgraced daughter of a farmer. She was simply Clara, a woman of the camp, her past a distant echo. She found she had a gift for healing, her knowledge of herbs learned from Istas proving effective. She found a purpose in tending to the sick and injured, her quiet competence earning her a place in the fabric of the community. She had found a new definition of pride. It was not the intellectual arrogance her brothers had despised, but a quiet confidence in her own ability to contribute, to endure, to belong. She was part of something larger than herself, a community bound by shared hardship and a fierce, enduring love for their land and their way of life. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the camp in a blanket of pristine white, she stood watching the children chase each other, their laughter bright against the encroaching dusk. Chaitan came and stood beside her, the two of them watching the scene in comfortable silence. They did not need many words anymore. A language of shared experience and mutual respect had grown between them, stronger than any spoken tongue. "The winter will be hard," he said, his voice a low murmur. "We will endure it," she replied, her voice calm and certain. It was not a hope, it was a fact. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes studying her profile against the falling snow. Her face was no longer etched with terror or despair, but with a serene and powerful peace. She was no longer the broken woman from the pigpen. She was whole. "You have found your home, Clara," he stated, his words an observation, not a question. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She looked away from the children and out toward the vast, snow-covered plains that stretched to the horizon, a land that was no longer a prison but a sanctuary. "No," she said softly, turning her gaze back to him, her eyes reflecting the deep, quiet strength he had first seen in her. "I have found my people." They stood together as the darkness deepened and the snow fell, two resilient souls from different worlds, bound by an act of unexpected kindness. In the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land, Clara had been freed not just from a physical cage, but from the prison of a society that had never understood her worth. She had found her place, not in a world of books and privilege, but under a wide prairie sky, among a people who valued the fire of the human spirit above all else.